Hi, I'm Kristin Molitor. Welcome to the Transforming Hearts podcast, brought to you by the Institute for Ministry Formation. We believe that transforming the church starts with transforming hearts. Join us as we explore ministry through the lens of relationship and accompaniment. Together, let's journey towards growth, healing, and transformation. Hello and welcome to the Transforming Hearts podcast. This is Kristin with the Institute for Ministry Formation, and today we have a very special guest on our show. We have one of our recent IMF graduates, Greg Sherwood. So Greg recently received the Master's of Arts in Ministry degree with a specialization in spiritual direction. So Greg's here to share about his journey with the IMF, share about his journey to the Catholic Church, and just share how he's using some of his formation in ministry right now. But I just want to give you a little bit of background on Greg. So after Greg entered the Catholic Church in 2017, he joined St. Michael's Parish staff in downtown Portland. He plays a vital role in adult faith formation, serving as a leader and instructor for the Ambassadors Galilea Ministry, OCIA, and the Adult Confirmation Program. In addition to his parish work, Greg is also a retreat speaker for various ministries, including the St. John Society and the Newman Center. Greg has been married to Debbie since 1983. They have 5 children and 8 grandchildren, and he's recently retired investment executive after a 35-year career. So Greg, it's good to have you here. Welcome to the show.
Yeah, nice to be here. Thank you.
So Greg, why don't you share a little bit about yourself and your journey to the Catholic Church, and then how you stumbled across the IMF?
Yeah, well, that's a common question I get for a lot of Catholics. And how did you find your way into the church at this age? And I would say this, that going way back, I did not grow up in any sort of faith at all. Very dysfunctional family, a lot of hard issues that I grew up with in my life, which marks us deeply. I think I ended up coming into a faith through my now wife, who was in those days Protestant at the Baptist church, and began my faith journey. But I would say that the conversion for me to begin to follow Christ was profound in those days. This was right before college, right at college level. And my faith was deep in there by a man who was ministering to us. I was an athlete, and it was through a college ministries there. And in those days, I really drove the stake to follow Christ. So in those, I can honestly say I've never looked back. Once I made a decision to follow Christ, that was a profound conversion for me, and that began a lifelong journey there. So I basically have then turned outwards to that. I've been an evangelist, if you will, with high school ministries, college ministries for up and today, even up 40 years later. I've started a nonprofit in 2021 called Mentors 360, where we went to college campuses. The idea of mentoring and spiritual direction, and those, maybe in today's parlance, for me as a Catholic, has been something I've done for most of my adult life. The journey into the church, like a lot of people, comes from different angles. For me, the quick of it is I read my way into the church, but I read my way in because I was doing so much teaching, read so many different sources of spirituality, and it dawned on me, going through some dark times, there's some latency issues when you grow up with dysfunction, that the language of the heart I was finding was most clear, the most deep understanding of the human heart was coming from my Catholic readings, St. Teresa of Avila and others. I was beginning to read some of the mystics, and Henry Nouwen, who is maybe some are familiar with, was helpful in this regard. And I basically began to try to trace this depth of understanding to the headwaters, which I didn't know at the time really resided within the Catholic Church. So that began my journey. So I began to go to Mass down at the cathedral because I had known friends that were Catholic at the time, and went to Mass for 4 years, doing double time with my Protestant community.
Wow.
But at the same time, yeah. And that was, I understood it immediately. I understood the beauty of the liturgy immediately. The scriptural background that I have is all over the liturgy, of course. And I think for the Protestant who comes into the Catholic Church with that background, they see the immediacy, the beauty of the liturgy and the beauty of the Catholic Church through the eyes of faith. And that began my journey. I met the St. John Society along the way, and that incarnated the church to me. There was people now associated with that, with their very similar heart to mine. And that began my journey into the program of in those days, RCIA, today OCIA. And it was, I would say and that was 8 years ago now. It was the most, other than my initial conversion to Christ, the most profound change directionally, to find the language that is found in the beauty of the sacramental life, the sources of grace in the church today that I really didn't know existed, has been, I can't say enough about it, how transformative it's been for me.
Yeah. Beautiful. Yeah. Then how, after your journey into the church, how did you stumble across the IMF? And
yeah, that's a good question. The divine intervention, I would say, at some level, I was new to the church, and my spiritual, if you would call him a spiritual director early on, was one of the priests of the St. John Society, Father Lucas Laborde they're from Argentina. And they quickly identified that I was a natural teacher. I was already doing some work with them along the way. And he took me aside and strongly suggested that I go to seminary. So this would have been in the early part of 2019, roughly a year and a half after I came into the church. I had gone to Israel on pilgrimage there. I'd gone back to Cyprus. So I was doing some work in the inner life there. And then providentially, Father Boniface and Father Thomas Ackland came to Mount Angel, a Benedictine abbey and monastery here in Oregon, promoting the book on spiritual direction. And it took about 13 seconds for me and Father Boniface to connect personally. And he introduced this idea that the IMF was being started in the fall of 2019, only 2 months later. And I said, I'm in 100%. So that was the beginning. Father Boniface and I connected personally, and I jumped into the first course being offered. And so I consider it providential to have been pushed, if you will, by Father Lucas and pulled by Father Boniface into the world of IMF.
oh, yeah, that's really beautiful. So in the infancy of your Catholic journey and in the infancy of the IMF, it's really
We were all babies
beautiful.
at the same time.
Yeah, and you came into
Yeah.
the IMF at our beginnings as well, and have been with us. So you said since 2019.
Right. Yep.
Yeah, and you have been such a gift to our program, Greg. So I was able to travel with Greg in Rome when our IMF made a pilgrimage out to Rome. We had some courses together, and I was able to get to know Greg on a more personal level. And Greg, all of the rich formation experiences that you bring, your appreciation for the sacraments and the liturgy as a new convert, I've always appreciated chatting about those things with you. And so you're just a real gift to our program. We're really proud that you're one of our graduates. But what about like within the program? So were there any courses that were more that connected to your heart more than others?
Yeah. As I mentioned, in the Protestant world, we call it the process of formation or the process of accompaniment, which is a word that called discipleship. And there's methods and techniques, perhaps, of doing that, walking with people. I think for me, being introduced to the ancient tradition of the spiritual direction and the deeper understanding with regard to what can be helpful to people was new to me in that regard. Not the idea of walking with someone, but the depth of which you could encounter someone at that deep of level, and then with all the wonderful teaching with regard to the inner workings of the interior life that comes from the Catholic spirituality of the St. Thomas Aquinas and et cetera, all these various courses. So Father Boniface's courses on Catholic spirituality was incredibly helpful to help me understand the dynamics, or I would call it the anatomy of the human soul. That was helpful. But then also what they call SD1 and SD2, these week-long part of the program, you spend a week with Father Boniface and Father Thomas Ackland with regard to the areas of spiritual direction and the deeper understanding. It was very helpful. Uh, Probably the most applicable, because that's the interface between us and the other person. How to do that, what kind of conversations, the preparation of the heart, all of that goes into that. And then the part two of that is the prayer, the deepening of prayer life, SD2. And so those two, in addition, it's sort of where all the teaching culminates. It's where all of it sort of enters into the practical application, whether it's
Mm-hmm.
theology or liturgy, all
Mm-hmm.
comes in to play in the encounter with the other. How this begins to synthesize into real conversations and real understanding. And then I think the prayer, the weekend prayer, was extremely helpful, because of course that's the vital sign. That's where our spiritual life is synthesized into the depths of our heart, is through only really in the
Yes.
moment of prayer. So we need to understand that and communicate that. Those two would be the most helpful, because they're so practical. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah, I loved how you said, so, accompaniment is something that you've certainly been familiar with in your Protestant background, but you said that was called discipling, right? This journeying
Right.
alongside, walking one on one.
Yeah.
But in the spirituality course, you were able to see like just how deep you can enter into the heart and the soul and the interior of another. I
Hmm.
mean, really, like it's limitless, the depths into which we can go in our relationship with the Lord, and then the practical ways that we can start to open up our hearts through vulnerability,
Hmm.
and so like that spiritual direction relationship can be very deep and very beautiful.
Oh yeah, for sure. I reflect often on Psalm 19, which is a very common psalm that the liturgy uses because it's so deep. But one of the great verses in there, the psalmist turns with an open heart and says to search me on my sins of error, my sins committed in error, those that are my sins from what he calls hidden faults, and of course the sins that we are willfully um, committing. And of course, in the confessional, in the sacrament of reconciliation, most of the sins are of the order of willful sins, things we know we've done. But then he reflects on two others. One is the hidden faults, and the others are sins committed in error. That's almost. And I think spiritual direction really begins to unpackage some of the deep issues of the human heart that sometimes we're blind to. I one of the analogies I give my directees is the idea that we, through the wounds of our lives, through relationships and various things that happen, it's like a broken windshield. Like someone threw a rock and shattered our windshield as we're driving, making progress in our life. And now we're looking through this windshield and the two or three good areas of the windshield in which we can see out of. And we do our best to live our lives with this broken windshield that we don't realize. And so spiritual direction can come into that space and begin, through the grace of God, begin to sort of repair the windshield, to begin to see
Mm,
the world in its reality. And I think that is what I've learned in the IMF, is how to sort of go to that spot in that inner and name names of the deep wounds that afflict us, create besetting sins, this repetitive sin issue. Why am I the way I am? Why is there deep-seated anger, anxiety, etc., in our lives? We can't explain it. Why this wounds of rejection and abandonment? These are the kinds of things that ultimately come to the surface in a new way. And I'll use Fred Rogers, because Fred Rogers is invoked in the immortal words of Mr. Rogers. He says, if it can be mentioned, it can be managed. I love that.
mm,
And so
mm-hmm.
sometimes you give language to the deep wounds of a person, and that is new for them in a certain way, and they begin now to be able to lay that into the Sacred Heart of Christ, and he can begin to do his great work of healing. So that's, in essence, what happens sometimes in our accompaniment with people, which is so beautiful to see that happen.
Right, right. And when the trust is there, the vulnerability can be there. When the vulnerability is there is when transformation begins. is really when my heart is exposed to another. And for the spiritual director to step into a space to be able to receive that heart, right? And then when somebody goes into prayer, they have a little bit more confidence in the way that Jesus will receive their heart. Um, I recently was listening to a talk by Dr. Anthony Lillis where he defined misery. You know, sometimes the saints talk about our misery, but misery is a love that ought to be there but is not there
Mm,
in our hearts, like the
mm,
love that was supposed to be there but
yeah.
is not there, the ways that we've been rejected or neglected or abandoned.
Mm,
And there's a particular way in which the spiritual director can even themselves pour love into that space, into the misery, and then ultimately help the directee bring that misery to love itself.
yeah, that's beautiful. Yeah, that's so true. Bob Schutz, and people might be familiar with his work. The
Mm-hmm.
VD Ministries talks about the seven deadly wounds. So, in light of that, he puts names to the misery, the abandonment, rejection, loneliness, and all of this, and gets to the very roots of when those wounds are, inflicted. And going back to the root of some of that is sort of the beginning of healing. And this is where the beautiful grace of God in Mark chapter 4, there's this great gospel teaching where we are instructed to water and so forth, and it grows, the heart or the soul grows. We know not how, it says. And so this is where you defer to Christ. I don't know how the healing actually happens, except that it's grace.
Mm,
And grace is often, as you say, mediated by another, right? The love of God. And so to be a source of mediation of God's love,
yeah.
the Holy Spirit, Romans 5, is poured into the heart, that it affects healing is, well, it doesn't get any better than that. To see someone being healed in front of your very eyes in time is just, you can see it in their eyes. You can see the lamp of the soul being, irradiated with love. And yeah, that's the beauty of spiritual direction. Yeah.
Yeah, it's like the image I have is like a withered plant, right? And the love is just the water we pour on. And eventually, slowly but surely, like it takes beauty, it's restored to beauty, it's restored to strength. It's like the color of it, the vibrancy of it. And
Yeah.
yeah,
Beautiful analogy. Yeah.
yeah, love is the water for our souls. It's the way that we begin to flourish and grow and thrive. And sometimes like spiritual direction or our journey of healing can sometimes turn into a project. Oh, I need to get better, like of perfection, right?
Yeah.
But it's really just the slow process of allowing ourselves to be loved and growing in love, and that transformation through the grace of God just takes place gradually and over time. It's not our project. It's something
Right.
that we
Right.
receive and take part in.
Yeah. And that's a great observation. I've noticed people who are in the used to a self-help metaphor or self-willed, or the what we call the self-sin, self-determination, self-reliance, will sort of impose that on themselves, and then their growth or perceived growth usually does not then alleviate its what its companions of anxiety and worry. There's never sort of this, because you never fully satisfied. True transformation in Christ is accompanied by joy and peace. So if you're still stressed about your growth, and I've noticed people will do this, that their own they've not been able to shed anxiety and worry and some sort of thing there. Joy and peace are usually what accompany someone who is really being changed interiorly by the power of Christ, and that's a distinction. Sometimes you need to point that out in your directees too.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's beautiful. So Greg, I know you're pretty active in ministry right now, as we had shared in your bio at the beginning of the show. Who are you accompanying right now? Like, how are you using some of your formation and accompaniment and spiritual direction in your current ministries?
Yeah, well, you and I had a nice conversation with Father Barnabas here a few weeks ago about
Hmm.
we have a very dynamic and I would say a younger demographic in our parish. The nature of our priests and our ministries are very, very much about the new evangelization, and that has been a powerfully effective. In our city, Portland is a very, as you maybe know, is a we're the least churched state in the country, and that that is very much felt in Portland. So that's a good news and bad news story. The good news about that is that it's hard to be a marginal Catholic, marginal Christian in our community because, well, when the heat is there or you're being rejected, it's you have to really examine your faith. So those that then have faith in our community are deep in their faith,
Hmm.
and the contrast then becomes great. So this is what's happened in our community. I would say that the median age of our parish is probably 28 or 29 years old.
Oh my goodness.
It's very young, yeah, very young. Huge influx of college students and young professionals and such. And so, spiritual direction is a wonderful thing, but sometimes people aren't quite as deeply formed to sort of have the self knowledge yet to sort of understand the inner workings of their heart. Some of these issues are just being discovered. They're just beginning to learn prayer again. Perhaps a lot of people are coming back to faith. Some are brand new to the faith. We have a lot of converts in our community. And so a lot of the work that I do have a number of directees, and that waxes and wanes. We have a very transitory community because people are moving on at age 25 to 35. They're still
Sure.
sort of in the career path, and sometimes these young folks move on. So there's but right now I think I've got 8 or 9 in terms of directees right now. That was down from 18 here about a year ago.
Whoa.
On the other hand, I meet with students and young professionals constantly, and I think maybe the term we used or you brought up was the idea of companionship. So we have spiritual accompaniment or spiritual direction at one level, which is kind of a deeper communication.
Hmm.
But there's a great need for spiritual companionship or mentoring or something of that nature, which I do a lot of. So that's more about, there's still some teaching involved in those encounters, teaching them to pray, teaching them how to read scripture, teaching them the meaning of the sacraments. There's a dialogue component to it, but it's not
Sure.
so much what they've discovered in their heart, listening to the Spirit in their own heart, as much as it is helping them understand the voice of the shepherd in their heart in a new way.
Hmm.
So it's nuanced, it's similar, but not quite as deep in some cases. So in that regard, gosh, I don't know. I have meetings every week. I can lose track of people. And then there's outside the community, there's lots. I probably have on my short list of guys I normally meet with men, there's probably somewhere between 40 and 50.
Wow.
Yeah, that intermittently come in and out that I'm in touch with. It's a lot.
Yeah. Well, real grace and charism that you possess, Greg, I think, and a real traction, I think, people to you and your giftings and accompaniment and spiritual direction. What's your favorite part about accompanying people?
Oh, wow. Well, I sometimes I think someone's accused me of this, and they're probably right. You sort of compensate for the holes in your own life sometimes, and which makes people who have come from dysfunction sometimes particularly effective, because the areas of the holes, the misery, as you mentioned earlier, things that didn't occur in your life, you sort of backfill and pursue that and have a heart for those that maybe who haven't had, a say healthy upbringings there. So my heart is for men. I love, I've got daughters but I spend most of my time with men, and I've been doing that for the better part of 40 years. And so I would not say it's an exaggeration to say I've met with thousands of young men over the course of my
Hmm.
lifetime in various venues, coach football and different things that come out and so forth, and college ministries and such. For me, to sit down with a man and listening to their hearts. I don't care where they are on the spectrum of their faith. I love it. I love that. I don't. My personal conviction is that men are some of the loneliest creatures on the planet, and I think their ability to access the interior part of their lives is greatly underdeveloped. And when you sit down with men and they are able to share their heart with you, as you begin to you become safe to them and you begin to ask the right questions, and prayerfully the Holy Spirit is opening them and they feel like they can become vulnerable, you have sometimes a very explosive responses. I mean that emotionally, that they've never been heard before. They've never listened to before. And I think that for me, in the final analysis, to sit across the table, or so to speak, with men, to get to hear their stories, and I don't know, it just I'm in my own bliss at that time. I think that's the best part for me.
That's really beautiful and profound, Greg. Such a gift, too, for these men to be able to experience someone who can connect or help them access their heart and connect with their heart. As you said, maybe, men are some of the loneliest people. And what does it mean to be lonely? I mean, when we can't share our hearts, when we're locked up inside, we can be with a lot of people and still feel lonely. But what brings us into communion, what brings us into relationship is an ability to share my heart. And if I'm going to share my heart, it means I have to access my heart and also allow my heart to be seen in my misery, in the places I need to be loved.
Mm.
And what a great gift, Greg, that you're able to offer some of these men and bring them into relationship and communion.
Yeah, you read about that in the church today, that there's an upswing in young men coming back to the Catholic Church. If anybody's out there listening to this, the Jordan Peterson effect or something, there's a longing for purpose and meaning out there, and there's certain people, the voices within our culture, that have sort of touched on that. And what I see from my perch is there is, in at least in our community, our Portland, city of Portland, there's a huge upswing of young men coming to faith, particularly attracted to the demands of the faith. I think it's a paradox there, but men sort of responded to things differently than women in some sense. And I was just at Adoration the other night with a bunch of college students. There's probably, gosh, I don't know, 30 of them in there. I came in behind. I was supposed to meet with one of them, as I normally do afterwards for some issues. And I was looking across the sea of the backs of all these heads. And I was in the back of the church. I was looking. I thought, my gosh, there's like 24 or 25 of these college students were young men. Only 4 or 5 young women.
Wow.
And that is so unusual, as you probably know. In most ministries today, there's women tend to dominate the processes of ministry here. And here in our community, we have a profound. Not that there aren't young women in our college ministries at the Newman Center, but I did a retreat for about 130, 140 students here, with 15 different colleges being represented there. And again, it was probably 2/3 men, young men.
Wow.
Yeah. So I don't know what's going on with that, but I'm excited to see that. And so I don't know. Maybe there's a new day here. I'm not sure.
Yeah. Powerful. That's really, really beautiful. Yes. We need men.
Yeah.
So Greg, we have just a minute or two left on the podcast today. Is there anything else you would like to share with our listeners about your story, the IMF program, your ministry, anything, any other thoughts or reflections that you have for us?
I would say that my closing thought would be, the wonderful tributaries of grace that we have in the church, starting with the sacraments and prayer and scripture and all of that. Drink deeply from that. It's so rich. Just as a testify, it has been such a tremendous gift to drink, if you will, from that living water. But I would say this too, that for anybody listening to this, that in my observations with all these people all my life is that unless there's an exterior expression of faith, it's very, I can personally say I've never seen much growth in the spirit, in the soul of a person, unless there's an exterior expression of the same faith. And so there's an overflow concept that I think needs to be understood in the church today. And not all of us are called to the same charisms. Not all of us have the same gifts or part of the body for
Sure.
certain. But
Mm-hmm.
I do think that there's great life and great growth if we can figure out a way to export our faith, convey the testimony of what Christ has done to us, and whatever that form looks like. That'd be my encouragement to people. And that's what the IMF is all about, I think.
Beautiful. Well, thank you, Greg, for sharing with us today, sharing your story, your wisdom, and your insights. And most especially, thank you for sharing from the heart.
Thank you. Thanks for having me.